Generosity.
Ahmed al-Badawi was a popular and respected man in the Bedouin village. In addition, he was very wise and mature. For his part, he considered it important to set an example for the children and other villagers. He tried to encourage others to be generous and caring. Moreover, Ahmed had the finest sheep in the land. Each day he took them out to graze over the rough habitat. One of his sheep was the fattest and healthiest anyone had ever seen. And, consequently, it was the envy of the village. The other villagers would watch Ahmed as he left the camp with his sheep, always looking enviously at the fattest and healthiest one. When he returned, people would always ask Ahmed how he acquired such a fine specimen. Ahmed would just shrug and go on his way. However, Ahmed actually knew the secret to his superb flock of sheep. Each day he took them out to graze, and he ensured that they had plenty of food and water. He talked to them quietly to keep them content. Indeed, he left no stone unturned when it came to being generous and caring toward them. The sheep returned the favor by thriving and by growing resplendent. One day, as Ahmed was returning from his daily routine, he looked out at the encampment. Are the villagers really good and generous, he wondered? Will they help other people who are in need? Ahmed considered this for a lengthy time. Although he knew they were decent people, he also knew that some of the villagers were envious and lazy. They rarely helped one another, and never strangers. Ultimately, Ahmed decided he was going to transform them. To do so, he would need to come up with a clever plan. Ahmed saw a striking example of the villagers' selfishness that evening when 3 visitors arrived at the camp. Although the visitors looked tired from their journey, the villagers didn't greet them. Instead, they turned away and continued their work. Ahmed was dismayed, so he quickly walked up to the visitors.
Greetings, friends, and welcome to our camp. Ah, thank you, friend,
said one of the visitors in a strange dialect.
Won't you join me for dinner?
Asked Ahmed.
We'd be delighted to,
they replied.
We'll be filled with gratitude.
The other villagers suddenly took notice, for Ahmed and his wife's lamb stew was famous in the camp. Some said this was because Ahmed and his wife knew the best techniques for cooking it. Others declared it was because Ahmed's sheep were the fattest and healthiest. They watched enviously as the 3 men entered Ahmed's tent. As they happily ate Ahmed's lamb stew, the 3 men, who were merchants from far away, all declared it was the finest they had ever tasted. The next day, the visitors watched as Ahmed led his sheep out of the village.
Why, that's a fine sheep you have there,
said one of the villagers, looking at Ahmed's fattest sheep.
Yes, it is,
said another.
I bet it would taste wonderful in a stew.
Fat and juicy,
said a third.
Yum.
Nevertheless, Ahmed didn't respond to their hints. Instead, he looked at his prized fat sheep and said,
Yes, it is a good-looking sheep, isn't it? Good day.
Later on, as Ahmed watched his sheep grazing, he began to think. He still needed a plan that would teach the village generosity. They clearly needed to learn it. But what would he do? Slowly, the solution came to him. When Ahmed returned to the village, he took his fattest and healthiest sheep. Together with his wife, he used the meat from his sheep to cook the most delicious stew he could. Ahmed and his wife used all their special techniques, adding garlic and other spices. They cooked the stew for a long, long time, so that the meat became tender and juicy. Soon the aroma and fragrances filled the tent. Ahmed knew that he and his wife had cooked their greatest stew ever. "Shall we share this stew?" asked Ahmed's wife.
Yes,
Said Ahmed.
but only with the most generous of the village.
"But who are the most generous in the village?" she asked.
I have a plan.
Said Ahmed. When night had fallen and the stars were glittering in the sky, Ahmed calculated that the time was right to put his plan into motion. He left his tent and cried out,
Fire! Fire in my tent! Help! Help! Fire!
5 people rushed into the cold night air, but all the rest of the villagers remained safely inside their tents. All those who had come rushing looked around. They could see no fire, for there wasn't one. All they could see was Ahmed standing dignified and alone.
Where is the fire?
They asked, trying to comprehend what was happening.
There is only a tiny fire,
Said Ahmed.
and it is under my cooking pot. Since you are prepared to help your neighbors, would you like to come and enjoy some lamb stew with my wife and me?
Oh, yes!
They said enthusiastically. That night, the most generous men and women in the village ate Ahmed's famous stew. They recounted stories, and everyone laughed and was happy. Toward the end of the night, one of the men said,
How do you concoct this stew, Ahmed?
"Yes, Ahmed, what's your secret?" said one of the women. "It could be the garlic and other spices," said Ahmed's wife.
Or it could be that I use meat from the finest sheep.
Said Ahmed. "Or it could be that we cook it for hours and hours," said Ahmed's wife.
Whatever the case, this is the best stew I've ever eaten.
Said the man, laughing. The following day, Ahmed took his sheep out grazing underneath overcast skies. When he returned, one of the generous villagers from the night before noticed that Ahmed's fattest sheep was missing.
Where is that fattest sheep of yours?
Asked the man.
Yes.
Said one of the other men, who hadn't come to help and so hadn't joined Ahmed for dinner.
What have you done with that sheep?
Ahmed turned to the generous villager.
Why, he gave you his life last night.
You mean that sheep stew we ate was made with your finest sheep?
Said the man, suddenly realizing what Ahmed meant. He was clearly impressed.
Yes,
said Ahmed.
all the most generous people came out of their tents when I cried for help, and as a reward, I brought them into my home for my finest meal.
The second man realized then that he had missed 2 chances the night before. He'd missed the chance to feel good about helping people when Ahmed had cried for help, and he'd missed the chance to enjoy Ahmed's stew. Soon, the entire village was discussing it. Then, one day, another group of visitors entered the camp. Immediately, the villagers stopped what they were doing.
Welcome, friends.
They said,
Thank you, friends.
said the visitors,
Come into my tent for some tea.
said one of the villagers,
And then to my tent for some figs.
said another,
And when you are tired, you can sleep in my tent,
said a third. Ahmed didn't have to say anything, for the villagers had already overwhelmed the visitors with their generosity. That night, Ahmed ate alone with his wife.
We've made a good stew, haven't we?
We have, Ahmed, said his wife. And they ate happily together.
Discuss. In the final scene of this story, the villagers show generosity to a group of visitors. How would the story change if it didn't have the final scene?